right, everyone, welcome to our Bible study today, and glad to see you. Those of you that are here in this room, welcome. Those of you that are joining us online, we want to welcome you also. We're glad you're a part of our time together today. Y'all know we have a whole lot more tables set up. Y'all know that we're having faith at home in here, so every night. So that's what's going on there, but I'm glad y'all made it today. I mentioned to y'all last Wednesday this book, Walk in the Bible, by Bruce Fuller. I found mine. I brought it with me today. It's one of the best books that I've read on just kind of the age of the patriarchs and the land of the Scripture, and of really the first 5 books of the Bible. And it's a really good read. So if you wanted to read something that just supplements your knowledge of ancient Israel and how these people lived, that's a book I would recommend to you, okay? So today we are going to finish Genesis 25, and then I'm going to take July off, as y'all know, and I'll spend some time studying and preparing, getting us ready for next year. But you'll have various people teaching on Wednesdays, okay? So Katie will oversee that, and she'll make sure somebody's going to teach the Bible every Wednesday. So we'll just trust Katie to manage that for us, okay? So let's look at what we're going to do today. Genesis 25. We're going to start in verse 12. And today, I want us to think about Isaac and Ishmael and Jacob and Esau. Now, if you'll look at chapter 25, verse 12, you'll see this phrase, "This is the account of." If you look at verse 19, you'll see this phrase, "This is the account of." In Hebrew, the toledot, that's the word that's used there. That word is used by some scholars to actually structure the book of Genesis. And maybe that's how Moses did it. What you and I have done in our study, we've divided Genesis into 2 main divisions. One is Genesis 1 through 11, that's primeval history. Genesis 12 through 50, the age of the patriarchs. So that's how I've done it. That's typically how most scholars divide the book of Genesis. However, there are some scholars who say you need to read the book of Genesis according to these toledot passages. There are 12 of them, okay? And you're to, according to that view, each one of them offers a certain perspective. It typically has to do with genealogy, what God's done in the past, and what God is about to do in this next section of material, okay? There will be several more of those, like in chapter 36, verse 1, you'll have the account of the life of Esau's family, so that's another toledot. Kenneth Matthews, who's written the New American Commentary on the book of Genesis, that's how he structures the book of Genesis. And he makes a break when you come to every one of those phrases. This is the account of, okay? So we've got 2 of them in this text today, okay? We've got one for Ishmael, and then we've got one for Isaac, all right? So if you look at chapter 25, verse 12, the death of Ishmael, it's where we are. So let's just look at what it says. Verse 12 says this, "This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Ishmael, whom Sarah's slave Hagar the Egyptian bore to Abraham." And then you have this listing of the 12 sons of Israel. I wanted to give you this quote from Derek Kidner. My favorite commentary in the book of Genesis is about this thick. It's thinner than the book of Genesis, so which is interesting. And but it is it's written by Derek Kidner, and it's dated. It's written back in the 60s, I think. It's in the, if y'all are familiar with the little Tyndale Old Testament commentary series, some of y'all maybe have seen those. They're these little small volumes. Derek Kidner is the champion of saying a whole lot in very few words. He just has that gift. Don't you wish every preacher had that gift? You know, say a whole lot in very few words. He's really good at it. Here's what he says about this account of Ishmael. He says, his 12 princes, notable in their times, but not in the history of salvation. His restless experience, no pilgrimage, but an end in itself. His nonconformism, a habit of mind, not a light to the nations. That's his take on Ishmael. So I love that little quote. So that's why I stuck it in there for y'all. What a word about Ishmael. What a contrast between Ishmael and Isaac, between Ishmael and Abraham, even though Ishmael's the son of Abraham. One of the reasons that Ishmael gets so much play in this passage and in this story is that he is a son of Abraham. And so he has a certain blessing that was placed upon him. But if you remember, God also told Hagar that he was going to contend with his brothers. Okay? In other words, those who are around him. So if you look at verse 18, here's what Moses says at the end of the Ishmael narrative. His descendants settled in an area from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. As you go toward Asher, and so basically he describes a Bedouin tribal life that spreads across Sinai, Syria, and Arabia. Okay, so his 12 children and their descendants are going to settle across a pretty large piece of property. 8 of these sons will appear later in the scripture, okay? But they don't figure in at all to the story of salvation. And then you come to the last statement, and they lived in hostility toward all the tribes related to them. It's kind of an interesting play on words in Hebrew, because in Hebrew it actually uses a singular pronoun. He lived in hostility. But most scholars believe the reference is through his descendants. That was the truth about Ishmael. So the prophecy came true. He'd be blessed. He'll have these sons. He'll be made into a nation, if you will. However, he was going to contend with those who are around him, and that's Moses' summary. Then you have the story of Isaac. And I really struggle sometimes with what to say about Isaac. So I've kind of landed on this. I would call Isaac the bridge patriarch, because we wait on Isaac for so long. I mean, think about how powerful the story is. Isaac is the son of promise, and he's the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and Sarah. However, in the actual narrative, if you just look at the text, look at the amount of text that's given and utilized, he's actually a bridge between the grandfather, Abraham, and the grandson, Jacob. Because when you look at the patriarchal narratives, those are the 2 chief figures in this material in our Old Testament, Abraham and Jacob. Now, Joseph will appear quite prominently as well, but Joseph will never be mentioned that way. In other words, you won't find God referring to himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. He'll just refer to himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Joseph doesn't get that level of play. A lot of textual material, but much of that is his connection to Jacob. So the story now hinges on Isaac. Now remember, back in chapter 25, verse 11, the Bible tells us that Abraham didn't bless Isaac. God blessed Isaac. Remember, we talked about that last time. It's kind of interesting the way it's worded there, because we know how important the blessing was from that father to the children. But for Isaac, his blessing came from God, which I think the reason for that is because the power of this story and the blessing on the stewarding of this promise is from God himself. And it's still at play here. So you've got Abraham, Jacob, and then Joseph. Very fascinating take on these 3 men. Abraham receives revelation from God, and in that revelation, he receives God's promise. Well, we're going to do Isaac, but we're very quickly going to go to Jacob. And guess what Jacob's going to receive? Revelation from God and promises from God. Very similar to Abraham. What's different, though, is the promises of God to Abraham typically are connected to an heir. The promises to Jacob are connected to land. And so Jacob's gift from God is the promise of a place. You have, in the Abraham story, you have kind of not really Abraham's, it's not really conflict, but you have this other person living alongside Abraham that adds context and texture to Abraham's story, and that's Lot. Well, Jacob is going to have somebody who lives right alongside of him who's going to add texture as well in context, but he's also going to be in conflict, and that is going to be Esau. The powerful story about Jacob is the process of transformation that occurs in Jacob's life. That's one of the reasons I love to read this story. Jacob is one of my all-time characters in the Old Testament. And the reason for that is because we get to watch this man grow and change. And then he's an inspiration to other writers. So as a matter of fact, if you were to look at the book of Hosea, when you get to the minor prophets, Hosea uses Jacob as a part of his prophetic understanding of what God has done in the past and where God is leading Israel. Let me read you what Hosea says about Jacob. In Hosea 12, verse 2, he says, "The Lord has a charge to bring against Judah. He will punish Jacob according to his ways and repay him according to his deeds. In the womb, he grasped his brother's heel. As a man, he struggled with God. He struggled with the angel, and he overcame him. He wept, and he begged for his favor. He found him at Bethel, and he talked with him there. The Lord God Almighty, the Lord is his name." Then in verse 12 of Hosea 12, he says, "Jacob fled to the country of Aram. Israel served to get a wife, and to pay for her, he tended sheep." So in that one chapter of Hosea, he basically covers Jacob's whole life. How Jacob was born in this very unusual way where he was holding on to the heel of his brother, but then he's going to contend with God. It's kind of a play on words in Hebrew. He's going to strive with God, and that's really going to become his name, Israel, the one who strives with or contends with God. And so that's the play on words there in Hosea. And then he's going to be a shepherd. He's going to tend sheep. He's going to work so that he'll have the opportunity to marry Rachel, is the reference in verse 12. And so you've got this very interesting bridge here between these two great men, Abraham and Jacob. And then, once you get past Jacob, then you're going to have the story of Joseph. And the story of Joseph is going to have some parallels. Remember, we've talked about, I think Luke has pointed this out several times when he's been teaching, the parallelism that you find in the writings of Moses. And so you've got the story of Abraham and Lot. You've got the story now you have the story of Isaac and Ishmael, and then you've got the story of Jacob and Esau, and you've got all these comparisons, kind of these parallelisms, if you will. Well, what about Joseph? Well, you've got Joseph and Judah. Even though they're not really rivals necessarily in the story, long term they are, because eventually when we get to the time of understanding the Messiah is not going to come from Joseph. The Messiah is going to come from Judah, Joseph's brother. Okay, so it's a fascinating way that this story is told. So with that said, let's look at, starting in verse 19, the birth of Esau and Jacob. Okay, two very fascinating, famous characters in our Old Testament. So here's what Moses says. There's the new Toledot, if you will, the new account of the family line of Abraham's son Isaac. So Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean from Padan Aram, sister of Laban the Aramean. Laban will feature prominently as the story goes on. Interestingly enough, look at verse 21. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. She was childless. And the Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her. And she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older, will serve the younger." When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob, the one who grasps, if you will. Notice what it says. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. So they're 40 years old when they got married, couldn't have children. And so Isaac prayed for 20 years, okay? And so they have these twins. And then it says, verse 27, the boys grew up. Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country. Jacob, the Hebrew says, Jacob was quiet He was quiet at home, stayed among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, and Rebekah loved Jacob. So, the birth of Esau and Jacob. Barren for 20 years. Point is that God's worked through real people in real time. Once again, during this time, when Isaac and Rebekah get married, for 20 years, the promise is under threat again because we have no heir. Okay, so as this story is unfolding, we're still watching the tension between how's this going to play out. If you didn't know the story, you may be wondering, how's this thing going to play out? 20 years later, they still don't have any children, and we've been promised Abraham's going to have this great nation. He's going to have descendants like the sand on the seashore. And he's got one son, and his son has no sons. So for 20 years, they wait. And then when she finally gets pregnant, she has this feeling that there's something going on in her womb that she doesn't understand. And she says, why is this happening to me? And then God gives her one of the earliest sonograms, I guess you could say, and says, here's what you need to know. There are 2 of them in your womb. No wonder you're feeling this. And something's already afoot in this story, okay? And what's about to unfold right in front of us is this rivalry between Esau and Jacob, okay? So I just put a few little notes on there for you about that. I love how the NIV translates it. There was jostling in the womb. What a good way to put it. So it was more than evidently normal activity for a mom. There was something going on here. And so God lets Rebekah in on the news. You actually have 2 nations in your womb. That's what's going on. And you want to talk about jostling, particularly in the ancient world, the older one's going to serve the younger one, which was just not the way it was done. Now, y'all remember what's going to happen to Jacob. Jacob's going to go eventually to Rebekah's brother's house, Laban, so that his brother doesn't kill him. And there he falls in love with Rachel. And when it comes time to get married, Laban is going to follow what typically happened in the ancient world. And he's going to make sure that Leah gets married first because the older is not supposed to serve the younger. Does that make sense? So that's at play everywhere, okay? But the Lord tells Rebekah, in your case, the older one's going to serve the younger one. And so then she has the 2 boys. The older one is ruddy, complected, red, covered with hair. So she names him Esau, hairy, ruddy. That's what that word means. But they notice when the baby comes out, the younger one's holding on to the heel. In other words, he's not going to let his brother go without him. And so he gets the name Jacob, which does mean the one who holds onto the heel. It was a Hebrew, in the Hebrew vernacular, it meant deceiver, trickster. It was an idiom, if you will. Then you get this interesting little note. Isaac loved Esau, and Rebekah loved Jacob. Don't you think that's a great way to parent? To go ahead, particularly when you have twins, just pick the favorite, don't y'all? And it worked out great in this family, right? It always does whenever you do that. So it's kind of interesting to me when you look at this story. Brothers in the patriarchal and in the primeval material struggle. Cain and Abel, very first set of brothers. And what's fascinating is the older one is the suspect one. Certainly true in the story of Cain and Abel. So much animosity and rivalry between the 2 boys that Cain ends up killing his brother. So the older one actually is an evil brother. Then you've got Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael's the older brother, 13 years older than Isaac. And I don't know that I would say, I don't know if y'all would agree with this or not, but would you say Abraham loved Ishmael and Sarah loved Isaac? I mean, I'm not going to say that Abraham didn't love Isaac, but, even in the text, he asked God, can't I just have Ishmael? I mean, isn't this enough? Do I have to have another one? And as soon as Isaac is born, Sarah's done with Ishmael. It's time for him to go want him out of our compound. So there's not I would say there's not the open animosity between Ishmael and Isaac. I don't think I'd put it that way. But I think Ishmael knew that he didn't quite belong and fit. Obviously, he got banished with his mom. And so there was at least some tension between the two. And here's what's fascinating. Once again, the older one was the one on the outs, and the younger one was the favored one. So now here we are again. Now we got Esau and Jacob. And you've got favoritism. You've got the dad favoring the older one, the mom favoring the younger one. But yet God's plan is at work here. It's a fascinating story. The rivalry between these two young men is going to be really powerful. One theologian put it like this. He says the rivalry between Ishmael and Isaac was the rivalry between two sons. The rivalry between Esau and Jacob is the rivalry between two brothers, which I think is a fascinating way to put it. But these are twins. You know, they got the same mom and the same daddy. They're going to be raised in the same tent. They got the same blessing, if you will, so to speak, at least as small children. And so they grow up with that. They're very different people. You know, they've got different propensities. And they're going to grow into this rivalry. And to me, it's a fascinating take on family as well as just the psyche of human beings when you read about these two boys. What's fascinating to me is how this story unfolds. If you think about the relationship between Esau and Jacob, which you're going to spend some time over these next few weeks studying Esau and Jacob with whoever's going to be teaching, Katie, Luke. There's several other people that are going to teach y'all for the next few weeks, so that's okay. So you'll get to watch this story. It's fascinating to me how the threat continues to exist for the promise. In other words, Abraham and Sarah, long journey where the promise was threatened. And then now you have Isaac and Rebekah, 20 years without a baby. The promise is threatened again. Finally, not only do you have a son, you have two sons. And so I'm sure they saw that as a blessing from God. What they didn't realize was these two sons are going to grow up and they're going to become threats to each other. So much so that Esau is going to have enough anger in him to believe that maybe he might just kill his brother. And so Jacob's going to have to flee. Now remember? And so this rivalry, this relationship is going to be really challenged. If you'll fast forward all the way to the book of Matthew, and Mary and Joseph go to Bethlehem, and they are descendants of Judah. And Mary gives birth to Jesus. And Jesus is a son of Jacob. Okay, he's from that line. And old King Herod threatens the very life of Jesus. And you remember who King Herod's line was connected to? Esau. Herod was an Edomite. The Edomites were linear descendants of Esau. So get all the way to the New Testament, and Esau's still trying to kill Jacob. Fascinating, isn't it? You got an Edomite ruler who issues an edict to snuff out one of Jacob's sons, Jesus. So this story to me, this how all these threads weave together is fascinating to me. So the story between Esau and Jacob, it's a powerful story. Jacob, of course, is going to have the blessing from God as well. He is going to be the son of promise. He is going to be the one that's going to steward this promise. And it's a reminder to me that it's the grace of God that makes those decisions. It's not necessarily, I wouldn't say, as this story unfolds, that you look at both of these men and say, man, both of these men are honorable in every single thing they do. Well, that would not be the case. They both have their weaknesses. So, for example, the very next story, the way you end Genesis 25, is this whole fascinating take on the birthright, which, of course, for us is it's a little far-fetched. It doesn't really fit in our culture. But in the ancient world, it was very prominent. So the older son was guaranteed twice what every other child gets. That was just how it was done. So if you had 13, or if you had 12 sons, then the older son would get 2/13, if you will. That's how they would measure it. But what if there's only two sons? With only two sons, then the older son gets 2/3 of everything. So how does that work out in the relationship? Well, I don't know. I guess it depends on the character of the person. You know, if there was rivalry, jealousy, whatever. Here's what I know. Jacob knew it. He knew the custom. So you get to verse 29, and it says, once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished, and said to Jacob, quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished, also called Edom, red. The Edomites come from him. Jacob said, absolutely, let me have your birthright. So here it is played out in the wide open between these two boys, you know. And what's fascinating about Esau is, he said, I'm about to die. What good is my birthright to me? Jacob said, swear it to me. So he swore it to him. And he gave his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew. He ate and drank, and he got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. And so he becomes now written in the halls of infamy. Because you'll get that phrase, you'll trade whatever for a bowl of porridge, right? That's kind of in our vernacular, because that's exactly what happened here between these two boys. So was Jacob jealous? I don't know if that was the point. Bottom line is, he negotiated this incredibly unfair negotiation, and Esau will lose his birthright to his younger brother. Fascinating story. Now, in the New Testament writers, their imagination was piqued by this story, by these two young men. There's much in the New Testament about the descendants of Abraham, and certainly about the life of Jacob and Esau. So, for example, if you were to look at Romans 9, Paul, in this very dense, challenging page of Scripture, Romans 9, it's about God's predestination and his choice of Israel through his grace, his anguish over Israel, but his choice of Israel according to his grace and his wisdom, right in the heart of Paul's argument. Listen to what Paul says in Romans 9, verse 10. He says, not only that, but Rebekah's children were conceived at the same time by our father Isaac. Now, his argument is, back in verse 7, he said, verse 6 rather, he says, not everybody who's descended from Israel is Israel. Paul is saying not all children of Abraham are actually children of Abraham. This is his argument. He says, verse 10, Rebekah's children were conceived at the same time by our father Isaac. Yet before the twins were born or had done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose and election might stand, not by works, but by him who calls, she was told the older will serve the younger. Just as it is written, Jacob I've loved, but Esau I hated. The idea that Esau was not the chosen one by the very sovereign grace of God. Why did God choose Abraham? It was God's sovereign choice. Why did God choose Jacob? It was God's sovereign choice. That's Paul's point. And Paul says, just because you were born into the lineage of Abraham doesn't mean you're now a spiritual descendant of Abraham. Look at Esau. Esau had every chance to be in on this, and he missed it. So Paul's arguing this from a theological perspective. Then the writer of Hebrews this whole book is really a sermon. And so he's drawing illustrations from the Old Testament. And so in Hebrews 12, verse 16, the writer of Hebrews says, see that no one is sexually immoral or is godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. So the writer of Hebrews refers to immoral people as promiscuous people who were interested in self-gratification, not long-term implications. And he says, just like Esau. Esau was interested in self-gratification, not long-term implications. So he took a bowl of porridge and forfeited his birthright. Don't be like that. So these stories find their way into the New Testament in some interesting ways in theological arguments. But what I would say to y'all is it's a fascinating take on many levels. It's a fascinating take to me on the whole story of the promise of God and how it's being stewarded by real people, the children of Abraham. It's also a story about God's sovereign choice and God's grace, how he protected these people. It's a story about God's provision. God provided for them. He provided heirs. He provided children, which is what he said he was going to do. It's a story about God's great plan of redemption. God's going to redeem all the world through this family. It's exactly what's happened. But on a human level, it's a fascinating story about real people who had real struggles and real issues, and they did real things. And fortunately or unfortunately, for some of these folks, their real stuff got written down in the Bible. And so it is what it is. Jacob, in spite of his faults, in spite of his frailties, as I said, he's really one of my favorite characters in the Bible. And I'm looking forward to you being able to just watch him grow and mature as he makes his way through this story, okay? All right, I'm going to stop right there. So, online, folks, thank you for joining us. We're grateful for you. God bless you. I will see you much later, okay?